Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we wanted to welcome back a very special guest. Today we have on Christian Miller. He's the AC Reid Professor of Philosophy at Wake Forest University, science contributor at Forbes, and past director of the Character Project, which researched moral character from the perspectives of psychology, philosophy, and theology. He's also the author of The Character Gap, How Good Are We? And Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of a Neglected Virtue. Welcome back, Christian.
It's great to be back. Good to see you guys again.
Absolutely, man. Really great to see you too. So I want to start off with a passage before we begin. Christian writes, sadly, though, honesty has gone missing in recent decades. It is largely absent from academic research. It seems to be rare in society, and it is not commonly found in discussions of how to become a better person. What is honesty? How is honesty related to integrity, courage, and tact? Is it always best to be honest? What are the ways of failing to be honest? These are important questions, but you will be hard pressed to find discussions of them among scholars. In my field of philosophy, for instance, outside of my work of my own team, there have been only 2 articles on honesty published in the past 50 years. Okay, so how is that? Like, how is that possible? Because especially if we're thinking of analytic philosophy, I mean, everything is sort of broken down and pretty much research ad nauseum, where you'll have like, these sort of smaller, narrowly defined concepts where you'll have like hundreds upon hundreds of articles on them. How come that wasn't the case with honesty?
I know, I've wondered myself. So the title of the book is Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of a Neglected Virtue. And I meant neglected primarily in that sense that scholars weren't paying attention to it. I have some hypotheses. I just don't know definitively what the answer is. So you're right that some topics in philosophy have gotten a lot of attention and been kind of researched to death. Topics like grounding, the grounding of reality. I mean, what in the world? But this one, you would have thought this would have been one of them as well. But keep in mind this, that in philosophy, virtue and character in general were neglected for quite some time in the 20th century. People in ethics were focused mainly on other approaches, like the approach associated with Kant, an approach associated with utilitarianism, and they were not interested as much in those general concepts. That changed at about the 1970s, 1980s with what we might call the virtue revolution. Kind of dissatisfaction with the available options and a return to the way philosophy first thought about ethics with the ancient Greeks, with Plato and Aristotle in terms of virtue and virtue ethics. So that comes along, and even there, though, the focus was more general, is on virtue writ large, the general concept and how that might help us live our lives. Particular virtues still were not getting much attention until, I would say, the 90s and then the turn of the century. And then at that point, it's kind of, there's no rhyme or reason which one gets picked up. So someone writes an article on modesty, for example, and puts forward a view about modesty, and the view is controversial, and then suddenly there are 20 responses. So that an industry develops around modesty. I mean, what? Why modesty? And at the same time, other ones which you might have thought would get a lot more attention didn't. So not just honesty, it's patience, generosity are 2 that come to mind. Graciousness is a third one. Gratitude. They were slow. Another part of the puzzle might be that honesty, you might think there's not much to say. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. If you're an honest person, you don't lie. What's there to write about? I mean, there's much more interesting puzzles to sort through in philosophy than that. And so maybe appearances were, I think, misleading, but appearances maybe suggested there wasn't much to do here. And finally, I think we're trying to change that perception and get people to pay a lot more attention to this neglected virtue.
Right, because you can be honest, but not for the right reason, right? I mean, essentially, I believe you give an example about a store owner who sells his products for at fair prices to everyone, when of course he could take advantage, let's say, of a richer client, but he doesn't do that. But not necessarily because that's part of his character and he wants to do the right thing. It might actually be just for business purposes, to not affect the business in the long term, which may not necessarily be the quote unquote right reason.
Right.
Yeah.
I wish I could claim that example and say it was mine, but actually Immanuel Kant got there first. So a rather more famous and influential philosopher came up with that one, but it works very well. If we're thinking about honesty, we can think about it in different ways. We can think about honest behavior just in it of itself and not consider where that behavior comes from. But I'm more interested in honesty, the virtue, so the character trait. And I think character traits are multifaceted and complex psychological dispositions in our minds. And so they have a behavioral side to them for sure, but they also have a motivational side, which is what you're getting at. So it's not enough if you're an honest person just to outwardly act honestly. In the example, it's not enough just to not cheat your customers and change the price depending upon how wealthy the customer is. That is part of it, though. I mean, you got to have the good behavior. If you don't have the good behavior, you're really not getting in the realm of virtue. But the heart matters too. So if it's just done for egoistic or self-interested reasons, to make more profits for the business, to make a good impression on the customers, whatever the reasons might be. In other contexts, to not fail out of school, to get a promotion at work. Those are all about me, ultimately. I'm doing this honest action because it'll somehow, I think, benefit me. And that does not count as honest motivation in my book. Now, that's controversial. People can debate that. And you might say, well, sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. I think it's always the case that self-interested motivation, thumbs down. Now, what is thumbs up then? Well, when it comes to honesty, I think there's still lots of different options. You can be honest towards others for loving reasons because you care about them. You can be honest towards others because they're your friends or friendship reasons. You can be honest towards others for reasons of justice and fairness because it's the just thing to do. You can be honest towards others because it's the right thing to do. It's your duty. Kant would have said that. You can even just say, because it's honest, the motivation, I want to be an honest person, or I want to do the honest thing, and explicitly mention honesty as the motive. All those are fine. I would not want to, be harsh on any of those. It's just the self-interested ones I think are questionable.
Yeah, I really like that I came to that part of your article where you talked about the sort of various reasons for like honest behavior. So, I was thinking the other day before actually reading it, I was wondering, okay, is it possible to actually not care about somebody, but still like want to do right by them? So my thinking was like, let's say for somebody who is, let's say maybe antisocial or psychopathic, right? I was like, well, is it really necessarily possible that like somebody, or is it like, let me see. So is it likely that a person is a psycho who's like, diagnosed a psychopath? Would they still be able to be an honest or good person, right? Despite the fact that they aren't really able to experience human connections. So, in thinking about that, I was thinking, well, no, maybe not. Maybe the idea there is that it's like, if you don't have the sort of empathy or at least like some sort of connection between you and the sort of recipient, right? It's probably not possible. But actually, no, it actually is if we start thinking about it. So the idea is that, it is nothing against, let's say, the clinical literature or nothing in the clinical literature against saying that the person with antisocial personality disorder doesn't have some sort of sense of duty. It's probably not likely, but definitely not impossible. But from your sort of understanding of the literature, I don't even know, maybe if there has been, maybe hasn't been research on this, but if we think about like correlations with honesty, which one of these reasons are more correlated with honesty? Is it the one that has to do with sort of, justice, duty, integrity, or is it the one that's more so due to the connection where it's like, well, I just love this person, therefore I want to treat them well?
Yeah. So that's lots of really interesting facets to that question. One was about the psychopaths. That's a whole topic right there. We don't really know for sure whether they're capable of moral motivation or not. It could be that they're capable of outward moral behavior, but they're doing it in order to mimic other people, but they don't really care about moral behavior for itself. It's just a matter of, I see this kind of greases the wheels, it facilitates social interaction to behave this moral way. So I don't want to get in trouble and punished for being immoral. So I'm going to go along with it, but I really don't really understand this or don't really care about it. Now, the broader question was, what's the correlation between honesty and honest behavior and different types of motivation? Now, this could be an empirical question or it could be an ethical question. If it as an ethical question, like, I'm fine with, normatively speaking, all those kinds of motivation. I would not want to privilege any of them so long as they're not self-interested. So that's already been said. As an empirical matter, which ones are more common? Well, I think it's hard to deny that when it comes to outward honest behavior, self-interested motivation is going to be the most common. And that means that we don't get to virtue yet. So if you're gonna, there's no systematic proof of this, but from what I've read of the existing literature, if you want to count up the times when people are honest, what most likely is going to be their motivation, it's going to be some kind of self-interested motivation. Now, put that aside, what about those other virtuous types? What's the frequency of it being friendship? What's the frequency of it being caring? What's the frequency of it being duty? I have no idea. I don't know if anyone does. Of which one of those more virtuous ones are more common? I think that's untapped territory.
Right, but isn't it striking that it's mostly self-interest that leads to honest behavior?
Well, it is, but I think that's not specific to honesty. I think that's probably generalizes to all moral behavior, and all virtuous behavior. So compassion, justice, all these other kinds of contexts, temperance, self-control. I fear that, the most common story is going to be the self-interested one, which goes in right along the lines of the more general story I tell about character, which is that most of us are not good enough to count as virtuous. And this is one of the reasons why. So we see the previous podcast for that one. But yeah, it fits nicely with the broader story of lack of virtue. Most people aren't virtuous, but on the other hand, most people aren't vicious either.
And how did you decide to narrow it down to honesty out of all of the virtues? Like, why focus on this one specifically?
Yeah. Well, frankly, I wanted to be honest. Oh, that's really bad.
Fun of the day.
Yeah, it's really bad. It lends itself to that so easily. It's just low-hanging fruit. I wanted to do something that hadn't been researched to death. Like the way you led off, some topics have just been so examined that all you can really do is move the needle a little bit and add one little wrinkle to the existing discussion. And I don't want to do that. I'm tired of doing that in other contexts. I wanted something fresh and exciting and novel and just uncharted territory. And that's one reason. And one part of what excited me about that is that I had a chance to put forward a view, and probably not the right view, probably it's going to be criticized a lot, but at least it's putting forward a view, and then hopefully that will spark a new, interest in this topic, and others will come along and tell me why I'm wrong and put forward their views, and then I'll respond to them, and we'll get this thing going, and we'll get, a new area of philosophy moving. That's exciting to me. The second reason, though, there's more to it. I could have done that with a really obscure virtue. I could have picked it, although what I just said could have been the case for some really obscure one. But honesty is really important. It's not just that it's neglected, it's extremely important too. And so I wanted something that was neglected and made a real difference in people's lives. So, at an abstract level, what does honesty contribute to? It contributes towards trust in other people. It contributes to stability of society. It contributes to intimate relationships. It contributes to friendships. When you poll people and ask them, what do you like most about people? Honesty is at the top.
Wow.
When you poll people, what do you want to know the most about someone? Honesty is at the top. When it goes missing, the impact is usually dramatic. Every day in the news, there's going to be some story about, not unfortunately honesty, about the absence of it. Whether it's the college admissions scandal, cheating to get your kids into some Ivy League school, or it's Ashley Madison websites, millions of people doing these affairs websites, or it's steroids, or it's Tiger Woods, or it's, pick your story of the day. It often has to come back to some kind of failure of honesty. So for those, sorry to long answer, but
that's okay.
Both because it's neglected and it gave me a chance to do something original, and because it's so important, I thought, let's do it.
Yeah, plus what's really great, especially about the Psyche article, which we're definitely going to put a link for in the description, you get into ways to encourage honesty And what's great about, exploring this topic is the more research and more momentum that we can get behind the research of this topic, the more ways we can find, to actually, systematically sort of influence honesty to be more of a not neglected virtue, but rather one that's paid attention to and given reverence to, rather. Could we maybe talk about ways to encourage honesty? I find that very fascinating. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. So this presupposes that honesty is not widespread. So you have to buy that part of the story already. If you already think most people are honest, then maybe you want to encourage it in the sense of you want to make people even more honest, or you want to keep the status quo and people don't want people's character to erode. But that's not the way I think about it. I think the empirical evidence, and we can get into some of the studies and why I think this, tells us, it paints a picture of widespread lack of the virtue of honesty. It also, though, suggests that there's capacity for change. So in general, our character is not hardwired. We're not stuck with what we have. We can move it. So then that invites the question, well, how can we, in this case, grow in honesty? I want to do two things when I think about growing in honesty. I want to strengthen the positive side of our character and weaken the negative side of our character. So I think most people believe that something like cheating and lying and stealing, they're all wrong, morally wrong. This is not something that has to be taught to people. Most people already know that. And then not just, they don't pay lip service to it, although psychopaths might. Most people really do sincerely believe that. So how can we strengthen that side, that belief, while also acknowledging that most people desire to, say, cheat if they think they can get away with it, not get caught, and it benefits them. So that's the negative side. We want to weaken that desire, and we want to strengthen the belief in the wrongness of, say, cheating, lying, and stealing. Okay, so let's take it in two parts then. Strengthening. Here, I think the two avenues look promising to me, and you can cut me off. I can go on the whole rest of our time. Cut me off at some point. Two avenues look promising here. One is nudging, more reminders, this kind of thing, and the other are more role models. So let's take the nudging and the more reminders. Since we do tend to believe that, say, cheating is wrong, what ends up happening is that we also tend to get caught up in our own self-interest. We get distracted. We think about what would benefit us, and we don't pay much attention to the wrongness of cheating. So if we have a more reminder that comes along, whether that's a reading, a sign, an email, an honor code in the school system, that can help get our priorities where they need to be and get our focus back on track. To make that a little bit less abstract, let me give you an example from my context, the educational context. So at Wake Forest, we have an honor code, which is a code of ethics that students are introduced to the very first day they come to campus, and it's reinforced all 4 years. And so specifically, when they take a test, they will first have to sign the honor code of our university. And in my case, I actually verbally recite it with them. I really go overboard, emphasizing this, and then they take the test. And what that does, what I hope it does, is that it reminds them of what they really care about, their values, and the importance of being an honest person. So that's an illustration of the idea of more reminders. The other one was about role models, and that's kind of self-explanatory. Having in our lives exemplars of honesty who are doing better than we are. Whether those are historical ones, we can go back thousands of years. We can go back more recently to Abraham Lincoln. Honest Abe is a famous American role model. But more impactful tend to be contemporary real people who we're in relationship with, who we can see on a regular basis, who are relatable to us, who we have an emotional connection to, and who inspire us emotionally, and not just cognitively, but emotionally, to become more like them. So seeking out those people for their integrity, for their honesty, for their authenticity, their sincerity, and not following them in everything they do, because no one's perfect and there are going to be some warts to their character probably, but at least in this area of their life, following their example are two things to strengthen the good side.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
No, is there a third?
Well, there's the weakening the bad side.
Mm-hmm.
So the weakening the bad side is, it's nice to strengthen the good side, but look, you're still left with this desire that we have to cheat other people,
Mm-hmm.
especially under certain conditions when we think we can get away with it and not get caught, and it benefits us, say monetarily or in the forms of pleasure or something like that. And so there, the most straightforward thing to do is invoke forms of punishment. Now, not saying I said straightforward, I'm not saying necessarily best, but if there's a corporation which makes it very clear we're not going to tolerate, stealing supplies from the company, and there are going to be severe punishments for that. That can weaken a desire to cheat, but it's not the only way. And one reason why it's good it's not the only way is that that's self-interested motivation. Again, I'm not going to cheat because I don't want to get punished.
Right.
The better way, although it's more nebulous and vague, I think, is to encourage love of others and caring for others and compassion for others.
Right.
Because the extent to which I love another person, it works to block my desire to cheat them or lie to them or steal from them. It's very hard to sincerely, selflessly care for someone else and also want to take advantage of them. So working against that desire to cheat, I think, is best done by fostering love and care for other people. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. So what that makes me think of, and I wonder what like your thoughts on this are. So do you know, I'm sure you do. So with the kind of explanation about honesty from evolutionary psych, right? Or just virtues in general. So what evolutionary psychologists would say is that essentially we've evolved these traits because they kind of benefit us in the long run, right? So they help us survive, they help us form communities, kind of we help us reproduce, protect one another, sort of, whatever. Like the idea is essentially that we're better off in the long run if we exhibit and express these virtues outside of rather than the opposite. So what are your thoughts on the fact that like in the long term, right? So let's say in the short term, obviously we know dishonesty is obviously terrible, right? So if you were, maybe not necessarily, but it's a bad thing, especially if you're found out. But in the long run, for some person, like maybe our psychopath, right? This sort of character that now we've made up. So if in the long term, right, the psychopath says, well, but if I'm honest, right, in the long run, the evolutionary psychologists tell me that I'll actually thrive and survive and reproduce or whatever, right? Within this community. And if this person does it, then, kind of we're all doing it for each other. And we all kind of build up this community that, again, outside of the emotions, it's logical, right? It's a rational decision. So what would you tell that person?
Boy, yeah, I probably have to think about it for a while. I probably have to pause like I am right now and think about what I want to say. Suppose the evolutionary story is right. What is it a story about? It's a story about how we came to get to this point. Mm-hmm. It's not a justification, ethical justification for acting that way. Even if it's right, and evolutionary psychological explanations of ethics are extremely controversial, and many of my colleagues who work in this area don't like them and reject them. Mm-hmm. Even if they're causal explanations or historical explanations for how we got there, that doesn't mean they justify a future behavior. Mm-hmm. So to switch topics for a moment, we can give an explanation for how aggressive feelings came along, and why we have feelings of anger and aggression. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense why maybe we evolved to have them. It doesn't mean that gives me license going forward to express my anger whenever I feel like it or be aggressive towards others. Mm-hmm. I now have reflective capacities. I have moral capacities to distance myself from my initial desires of anger or say desire to cheat, and reflect about them and think, is this a good thing or not? Is this how I should live my life? So that's the initial point. Now, what do you say more specifically to that person who says, look, no. In the long run, I'm going to benefit from cheating, from dishonesty. And so, you moral philosophers, you tell a nice story, but I'm not going to buy it. Mm-hmm. You could say different things, but ultimately, I doubt you're going to be able to persuade this person. So it might depend upon what our goal is here. if the goal is to actually change someone's mind and persuade them from that kind of mindsets, good luck. Good luck. Can you say something reasonable to people who are not like that, but are on the fence and are wondering which way to live their life? That's who I would be really wanting to speak to, who might move their thoughts on the matter. You could point to, the obvious fact that it's really hard to get away with it.
Right.
So, Socrates and Plato talked about that long ago, although again, that takes us back into self-interest. So don't do it because you might get caught, you might get punished. That's ultimately about egoism again. You could talk about afterlife arguments. You could talk about religious frameworks. Worry there again is that that's going to take us back into self-interest. I'm not going to do this because although I might benefit in this life, I might get punished in the next life.
All right.
That's another direction you can go in. But ultimately, it's again self-interested. You could just start talking about what is right and wrong in and of itself. What is intrinsically valuable? What is good apart from benefits for yourself? I think all virtues are intrinsically valuable. They're good in and of themselves, regardless of whether we benefit or not. But no psychopath is going to buy that argument. They're not going to be persuaded by that. So you could talk about benefits for society. It might be the case that you benefit, but if everyone acts this way, it's not at all clear that's going to benefit society.
Right.
So there's a difference between you doing that and everyone else doing it. So there are different directions you can go in. I don't think you're ultimately going to be able to persuade that person.
No. I wonder if
Go for it. I'll say it after.
Okay, why did you? Okay, so
Actually, sorry, very quick point.
Yeah.
So for that person that's on the fence that you would speak to about this, it seems to me that somebody who thinks about self-preservation or just self-interest and has that sort of self-interested motivation has a mindset of win-lose. Like where's my benefit out of this? And they don't really think of anyone else's benefit. But it seems to be the case that when somebody thinks win-win, or generally, I mean, it seems to be that what you're saying is really you're thinking about the other person's win in a sense. You may not even necessarily be thinking about what's in it for you.
Right.
So that's actually the sense that I'm getting.
Right.
But I, for those people that, let's say, like using the afterlife argument, let's say how you can sort of, how that kind of comes back to self-interest, like, oh, well, if I do good deeds, maybe that'll win me, I'll go to heaven, I'll have a great afterlife, but I wonder if for the person that thinks win-win, at least, that's sort of a way to sort of like bring them over to this side of thinking about the other person.
Right, you're getting closer. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like we're approaching thinking about them solely.
You know what, man, this is so interesting. I was actually thinking of something similar.
Oh, cool.
So cool. All right, so I was actually thinking of the concept of recapitulation. So what I was thinking is, I wonder, here's what I mean by that. So what I was wondering is if like this entire argument is, so the argument from evolutionary psychologists, I just really wonder if it's like a case of black and white thinking, where the answer is technically both are true. And so here's what I mean by that. So when you're thinking about children, you actually, and I'm not saying this is true for everybody, because some kids are just naturally more empathic than others, but usually what happens is when you raise a kid, you tell the kid, okay, look, if you do the right thing, you'll get a reward for it, right? And then it's like, you do your homework for an hour, you can go play video games. Let's say you share your toys with your sister, we'll buy you ice cream or whatever, right? But somewhere down the line, there's a relationship that builds. So let's say, brother and sister, right? So if, let's say, one of the kids starts sharing with the other, like let's say the boy starts sharing with the girl, and then vice versa, then they automatically they see the joy in the other person, and they think, oh wow, I actually kind of like this. Like even without the reward, I still think I'd share my toys with my sister. So I wonder if evolutionarily speaking, and of course, who knows how this works, and it's probably bidirectional, but I wonder if what actually happened was, and obviously it's so difficult to talk about, but like I wonder if what actually happened is sort of initially we were hyper rational and we were thinking, okay, a great way for us to survive is to literally work in unison and to work in teams, right? But then as we were just like really kind of nurturing, in this case, honesty, all of these different virtues with one another, we realized, hey, I actually like making my homie feel good, right? It makes me feel happy to make this other person happy. So it's like somewhere down the line, right, the sort of rational became emotional.
Very good. Great stuff there. You really should teach my philosophy class. Have you guest lecture. I like the general idea about how to grow in virtue here. I don't have any idea about the historical point as to whether this historically was the way it happened. But when we think about people on the fence who are wondering about whether to become more honest or not, I think it's quite appropriate to speak to them first in terms of what's in their self-interest, just how this would benefit them. Look, if you become more honest and more virtuous in general, your life is probably going to go better for you. And there's empirical data to back this up, correlations between increasing virtue and increasing benefits in life. And if they're religious, you can appeal to afterlife rewards too, and say, look, it's probably going to go better for you in the afterlife too. And then, so that we start out at the self-interested level, because other kinds of arguments are probably not going to have a hook on them. But as you said, as you get it more immersed in that kind of way of life, and it becomes more of who you are and more habitual and instinctive and natural, you can your motivation can pivot and change, and you can start to see value in what you're doing, independent of whether it benefits you.
Right.
But here's the really cool thing. It can still benefit you. So you can, as you move along and progress towards virtue, your motivation might become less self-interested, but you can benefit and maybe benefit even more. How's that work? Well, the benefits become less the focus and more the byproduct. The focus, the goal is to help others, or is to tell the truth, or is to be just towards your friends. But as a side effect or byproduct of that, you can benefit too.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I like the relationship point too. So in the context of a relationship, look, we want good relationships. We want to have deep friendships. We want to have deep romantic relationships and so forth. Most people do. And we might start out thinking, I'm going to benefit from this. If it's going to become a really genuine friendship, and it better become other-centered, my perspective changes. I'm going to be focused on what's good for my friends. But as that relationship deepens and we become better friends, I take more enjoyment in the friendship. Not as the goal, but as a byproduct, as a side effect. And so it's win-win. Just like you said, I like that framework. I win indirectly, and the other person wins directly from my actions. And so it is win-win.
Wow.
Yeah, I love that. And so, I mean, just to go back to an earlier idea that we had. So in terms of the virtues, right, how would we classify them? Where are they in terms of, so what people specifically look for in another, let's say in a partner in a relationship, what they look for in friendships, wherever, just in any kind of type of relationships, right? So how would we sort of rate them? Would honesty be number one?
So this, I have to pull up some data here. The data I've seen by our team suggests that they had, I think, 60 different personality measures, and they had people rate, the importance of these different measures on a couple of different categories: liking, what you want to know about someone else, and I think there was one more. And you might have expected other things to bubble up to the top, and honesty was at the top, significantly above all the others. In fact, I can, if you want to give me a second, I can look it up for you. But
no, but that's what I was curious about. Was honesty number one? Because so what I was thinking about is often you hear this, like where a person would say, well, you know what? I don't care if this person's an asshole. They're honest, right? So I really appreciate the fact that like this person gets to be themselves. And it was funny too, because like Alan and I were talking earlier, and I was actually wondering if that's what you liked about me. It's like, oh, well, he's an asshole, but at least he's honest.
Honestly, we were actually, we had a guest on last week. Daryl Strickle. He wrote a book called Building Trust. And one of the things that we talked about in the podcast was a clip I saw of Simon Sinek, a famous speaker, public speaker. And so he's talking about the Marines and their process for choosing teammates. And he draws this graph. And on one side of the graph, there's ability, how well they perform, their skill level. And the other side of the graph, it's their trustworthiness, right? And he said, believe it or not, we don't pick the people who are high in ability and low in trustworthiness. Generally speaking, we usually just pick the people who are medium ability, medium trustworthiness, or low ability, high trustworthiness, right? And I feel like that relates to honesty in the sense that especially in the context of the Marines, right? You need to be able to trust the other person with your life, right? And it seems to me that, I mean, this is also a highly valued trait just in general, whether it's at work or in relationships as well. I'd rather somebody who's incredibly trustworthy and would tell me anything, even if it's incredibly, like, sometimes the truth can hurt, right? But the thing is, if
this is Alan's way of saying I am an asshole.
No, not at all. No. In fact, there are things that I've expressed before that make me look like a little bit of an asshole, even though I try to move things in a way that tries to lessen the blow, right? I mean, that kind of comes out in my behavior as well. But yes, there's sometimes you do have to I mean, of course, people lie to preserve somebody else's feelings too. But I feel like if you tell them the truth, but then you try to say that or show in your actions that you're framing the truth in a way that you still have care about how they're receiving the information from you, it's not that version of the bad version of being honest. It's probably the good version of being honest.
Yeah. Being dishonest. Yes. Yeah. So let me make two comments. One is I was able to get the data really quickly. So on liking, respecting, and knowing, honesty is first.
Wow.
Even compared to other traits like how funny someone is, intelligence, humble, mature, peaceful, kind, giving, trusting, fair, and compassionate. Honesty rises to the top for liking, respecting, and knowing. And this is research done by colleagues on our team for the Honesty Project, colleagues of mine in psychology at Wake Forest. On the last point, I think you're quite right. We have to think, are there limits here to the honesty? Is there such a thing as excessive honesty, where you're too honest with someone else? And are there cases in which, well, maybe I need to curb my honesty a bit for the sake of the relationship, but still the relationship is pretty healthy nonetheless. These we might call beneficial kinds of dishonesty. And I think the answer is yes, there are. And I think you nicely articulated that there's a big difference between someone who's cheating with a third party or stealing money from the bank account, that clear, blatant kinds of dishonesty that are going to harm the relationship, and the more common white lie scenarios. How do I look in this? Fill it in the blank. Dress, pants. How's the haircut look? How was the dessert? This kind of thing. There, you might say, do you need to be maximally honest for the relationship to be healthy and strong? You could debate that, you could argue it, but I think a number of people would say, no, not necessarily. As long as you're withholding your true thoughts for compassionate reasons, because you care about the other person, then you have a scenario where two virtues come into play. You have honesty on the one hand, but you also have compassion on the other hand. And there might be situations where, yeah, I mean, honesty it's important, but it's not the only thing that's important. And it gets outweighed by compassion. And so all things considered, it's okay to tell that white lie.
And so far, what are the hypotheses about why honesty is number one?
No idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, if I had to guess, I mean, it seems like just predictability. If it's like, if you just know what you're getting yourself into, and I mean, just not only just predictability in terms of being harmed physically, but I think even emotionally, because I mean, so this is like kind of an issue that we have like in our parts where a lot of folks here are fake, which is pretty shitty. And it's something that we've all kind of grown up with and sort of grown accustomed to. And it's really hard because like you'll have somebody who will tell you how great you are, or at the very least will be friendly to you. And then you'll come to find out behind your back, they have a lot of stuff to say about you. And it's like, I mean, it's not just disingenuous, but it's also disheartening. So there's a sense of like, you know, kind of emotional pain that comes with that. So if I had to guess, I would assume that people want to avoid that. And the idea is like, well, I'd rather you just be truthful to me about this thing that you dislike about me, as opposed to finding out about it somewhere else.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's very plausible, but I don't know of any rigorous validation of that. That'd be a great study. Come up with multiple hypotheses and try and test them.
If I had to guess, I mean, I wouldn't call this a hypothesis per se, but probably it helps people predict predict the world by being able to suss out that somebody is honest. They can at least feel more at ease, more secure about their interactions with that person in whatever context.
Right.
Um,
And trust comes in here.
yeah.
So because I am confident that you're honest, you're going to be honest with me, and I'm going to be honest with you, we can trust each other going forward. And that's related to prediction, of course. I could trust that you're going to do right by me in the future, and I'm going to do right by you. You're going to be dependable. You're not going to betray me. You're not going to talk behind my back. So I think trust has to come into this as well.
Yeah. And sometimes, like, not to get into this too much because it's a little bit of a sad topic. But clinically speaking, like, you sometimes hear from clients that they'd rather be in terrible relationships where it's predictable, and even though bad things happen to them, they kind of can see them coming, as opposed to just waiting for the other shoe to drop with somebody who's a good partner.
Interesting.
Yeah, you actually get that a lot, where the idea is like, well, I don't know what this person. No, it's not even I don't know. It's I know what this person is thinking. I just don't want to. So let me see. I can explain this. It's I know what this person is thinking, but they just don't want to hurt my feelings. So somewhere down the line, they're going to abandon me. Whereas with the person who's kind of treating me like shit, the idea is like, well, I mean, number one, this is sort of the way I see myself, and number two is like I kind of know what's coming. Yeah. So it's interesting, but it's interesting. And it's interesting how important honesty is, again, for emotional well-being, where the idea is that we oftentimes would rather just be able to predict it and have a life that's not so great, as opposed to taking a risk, especially when we don't think that it's possible for us, right? Or think there's a low probability of it, but then take the risk with somebody who is, to us at least, seemingly dishonest because they don't see us the way we see ourselves.
But just how much? I mean, I would say this in the version of having a good partner that's less predictable. I mean, wouldn't you argue that there isn't enough honesty there for you to
what's interesting? So, okay, I love that. But then the person would argue that even within dishonesty, I can predict that. So that it's like Trump, right? So Trump is a great example. When people would say, like, oh, well, yeah, Trump lies, right? But we know he's lying, right? He knows he's lying. We know he's lying. Everybody knows he's lying, right? So it's like there's an honesty there of a sort, right? So it's a twisted version of honesty. But how many of his supporters have said, like, yeah, of course we know he's lying. Like, he tells us this all the time, right? It's not, we don't care, right? So it's like, again, as long as we can predict the behavior, there's a way of trusting it. So it's so interesting, like these different manifestations of honesty and what they could look like.
Interesting.
Interesting that you said lying. You might think it's more BSing.
Right. And what's the difference?
Well, the one really fascinating thing about it, honestly, is another reason I got into it. I should have said this earlier on, is that it's so broad in scope and multifaceted, way beyond what you might have initially appreciated. So when I ask people, what is the way to fail to be honest? People say, of course, lie. Liars fail to be honest. That's kind of the end of the story. But that's just one of many ways to fail to be honest. Misleading someone else, cheating someone else, stealing, breaking promises, deceiving, being a hypocrite, and BSing. So a bullshitter is someone who's failing to be honest, but in ways that are distinct from those other kinds. So someone who lies genuinely cares about the truth and knowingly is presenting something that's false. Someone who BS's doesn't care about the truth. Harry Frankfurt is famous in philosophy for his book on bullshit. It got him, even on the late night shows. The one philosopher ever made it on the late night shows.
Wow.
He's famous. He's a hero for us. So he wrote this book on all bullshit. So highly recommend it. It's a very short book. And so his view is that, look, the bullshitter just doesn't care in the first place whether their utterances are true or false. They're just making things up. Is it raining in Seattle? Does it rain a lot in Seattle? I don't know. Yeah, it rains a lot in Seattle. Sure. I'm just making that up. And you might have thought someone like Trump, that was actually more of his approach, rather than knowing this was not accurate. He just was kind of flying by the seat of his pants and fabricating things as he went along. So, just a quick side note that all this was by way of saying there are interesting ways to fail to be honest besides just being an outright liar.
Yeah, right. Because it seems like such a straightforward and uncontroversial topic. But like, kind of when we start reading about it and looking into it a little bit deeper, you see that there are actually kind of various forms, at least of dishonesty, if not honesty. So I don't know. I guess I wouldn't say that Trump was even being honest to those people, but it's kind of just interesting how they would even frame it as that, where like maybe just cognitive dissonance, where they could say on the one hand, well, yeah, I know he's full of shit, but like I still know he likes me or he treats me well or whatever it is, however you kind of want to conceptualize it. So maybe it's just cognitive dissonance. Again, maybe it's not even honesty isn't the right term here. But it's really interesting how like some people would legitimately admit, like, yeah, I know he's full of shit, but like, no, but he's still a likable guy. It's like, huh? How do you kind of make sense of the two, especially if honesty is the first thing that people look for?
Yeah.
So
yeah, that is a tough one to square with that data. I agree with you.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, here's another failure of honesty. Misleading.
Mm-hmm.
So this also, I mean, Trump could be used here, but I think it's just take it more generally. Suppose here's an interesting fact. I can say true things to you and be dishonest.
Yep.
So, and I know that they're true. I'm not just making it up. It's not BS. I know that I'm saying true things to you and I'm being dishonest. That's pretty subtle. It's not lying. So here, how would that work? Well, here's an example I like to use. A guy comes home and from a night out, and the next day his significant other says, "Where were you?" And he says, "Well, I was at the bar." And that's all he says, and that's true. He was at the bar, but of course, in this example, that wasn't the only place he was last night. He went somewhere else with someone else after the bar,
right?
And he conveniently leaves that out because he wants the person to draw a mistaken conclusion from his true statement. So you mislead people to arrive at falsity in a dishonest way by saying true things.
Oh, so it's like a lie of omission, right? It's like where the idea is like, oh, well, yes, sure, I was at the bar, but I did other things, and I'm just going to what happened to mention the bar only.
Yeah, but I mean, you are saying it's more than that, than just lying by omission. I mean, you are saying true things. I was at the bar last night. Yeah, you're omitting the key extra detail. I was somewhere else as well.
Right.
And so you can fail to be honest by lying and telling outright falsities, but you can also by telling true things that you just made up, and by telling true things that you know are true in a misleading way. Lots of pitfalls here when it comes to honesty. And
right.
So it's not enough. We shouldn't congratulate ourselves for not lying if we're doing some of these other things instead.
So, and the difference between this and confirmation bias would be essentially that one is unconscious and the other one, that the motive is to sort of lie by omit a truth or lie by omission, or let's say kind of exaggerate in a way.
Yeah. That works for me. Yeah, that makes sense. We haven't got into the conscious unconscious dimension to all this too.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, so it seems to me that we might think of ourselves as pretty honest people, and as a matter of fact, we're less honest than we really than we think we are, and that might be in part because of some unconscious influences and the way that this works, not only consciously and unconsciously. So let me give you a study. We haven't gotten much into the empirical literature this go around. So here's a famous study from the 1970s. Participants came in, they were seated at a desk, they took a test, they were told, the person in charge said, "I have to leave the room, I'm going to set a timer. When the timer goes off after 5 minutes, I want you to stop the test." There was a two-way mirror. They didn't know it was a two-way mirror, but they were able to be covertly observed. And when the 5 minutes was up and the timer went off, it was, question, did they stop the test or not? And 70+% of them kept working after the 5 minutes. Okay, now that's a kind of standard example of lack of honesty. They're cheating on the test and not following the instructions. Now, what does this have to do with the unconscious part? Well, there was another variation, another group where in this situation, they had the same test, the same setup in the room, except that they were seated in front of a mirror. That was the only difference. In the first group, they were seated at a desk. This time they were seated in front of a mirror.
Mhm.
And they took the test. The timer went off after 5 minutes. And I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was almost no one went beyond 5 minutes.
Mhm.
So the only difference was the placement in front of the mirror.
Hmm.
And why is that relevant to the topic we raised?
Mhm.
Consciously, that's not making a difference to people.
Right.
They don't
Because it's just
see
a
it.
mirror.
Yeah, just a mirror. What
Right.
difference does that make? But unconsciously, it's making a significant difference as to whether they cheat or not.
Mhm.
And the story that's told about this, it's not proved, but it's the most reasonable story that's out there, is that we want to think of ourselves as honest people.
Mhm.
Not always explicitly, but often unconsciously. We want to think, and this is symptomatic of a larger desire to think of ourselves as good people. We want to think of ourselves as good people. But in this context, as honest people, when you're facing the mirror, it's hard to then turn around and cheat and think of yourself as a good person. The mirror forces you to look at yourself, literally,
Mhm.
and also subconsciously. And then it's hard to put that together with a desire to think of yourself as an honest person and also turn around and cheat.
Mhm.
So it looks like there's definitely some subconscious influences going on cheating, or in this case, not cheating, lack of cheating behavior.
Mhm.
And then a mirror study has been replicated multiple times. It's one of the coolest findings in this literature. I like it a lot.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And then what about like the fact that there's a hypocrisy here too, that some of these studies actually kind of fell victim to the replication crisis. And you literally have these studies on honesty that obviously kind of fall victim. So
Yeah.
crazy, man. Like, so can you tell us a little bit which
Yeah,
ones did?
yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
those are
Well,
some good ones.
I think there are three things here we want to separate. There's the fact that many studies of honesty use dishonesty in the study.
Mhm.
That's kind of cool, and somewhat paradoxical. So they'll, for example, they'll lie to participants as part of a cover story to get them to do something.
Mhm.
So they're being dishonest to the participants to gauge their honesty. That's not primarily what you're interested in, but I think it's it's pretty interesting in its own right.
Definitely.
Secondly, there's the replication crisis. Now that may not be a function of dishonesty at all. It might just be a function of poorly designed studies.
Mhm.
So studies that had too few participants, and so they're making big generalizations or big conclusions when they didn't have a large enough sample size,
Mhm.
or they focused on a student population and that didn't generalize to non-students, or they focused just on this American population, it didn't generalize cross-culturally. And there are studies like that where I don't think there was any dishonesty involved. It was just not highly powered enough, or not well done enough. So unfortunately, a couple of these studies I've cited and used before they failed to replicate. So it makes me look like an idiot. But
Hey, don't forget Danny Kahneman. Oh my God, there was this famous study that he used in the Thinking Fast and Slow book.
Yeah.
I think it was, do you remember which one it was?
I know what you're talking about. An entire chapter of that book now has failed to replicate.
Yeah, the whole chapter. Yeah,
yeah.
He was like, oh yeah, forget everything I said in that chapter. And it was something
Yeah.
that was super controversial.
Yeah.
Oh my God, what was it? And then I remember he did a talk about it, and somebody asked him, they're like, hey, like, what do you actually think about this? Because this seems kind of like bullshit. And he was like, no. He's like, look, I thought the same thing, but the study checks out. He's like, and I have to go where the data goes. Literally 5 to 6 years later, it's out there. You're looking it up?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Oh my God, and it was so good too. But yeah, so but it's right. So yeah, go ahead.
So there's those studies, and look, sad they didn't replicate, but I don't think they necessarily involve dishonesty. Now, there's a third category though, where is there some evidence of actual dishonesty in the carrying out of the study,
Mhm.
as in like faking the data? Well, there we've got a failure of honesty, and then you can tell me what you found out in a minute. And there's one that's gotten a lot of attention in the last year. So Dan Ariely, who's a very, very prominent psychologist at Duke University, wrote multiple bestsellers. He did this one study where it was looking at whether having you sign an honor pledge, or kind of a no cheating pledge on a tax form, or I'm sorry, on an insurance form.
Mhm.
And if you did that at the beginning of the form as opposed to the end of the form, would that make a difference as to how honest people were in their reporting on the form?
Mhm.
And his data suggested yes, and it was published, and it was very widely cited, and it to the point where the government started thinking about, should we change our tax forms in light of this data? Turned out in the last year was discovered that there's no way this data could have actually worked out this way. It was impossible. And so either he faked it or the insurance company that he worked with faked the data, but someone faked it. We don't know for sure. And so that the results as a consequence are invalidated, the study was retracted, and all that work went up in smoke.
Wow, man.
Because of intentional dishonesty by someone.
But you're saying essentially with the replication crisis is just a small number of people who at least have been proven to have been dishonest.
Well, again, as far as outright dishonesty, that would mean that a scientist, fudges the data, changes the numbers, didn't get these numbers, but changes them to something else to get a cool publishable result.
Right.
That I think has not been found to happen very much.
Right.
Dan Ariely is what I was an example of that. When we talk about the replication crisis, I think those were met well, typically well-meaning, well-intentioned scientists who's just conducted studies that unfortunately did not generalize.
Right.
So let me if you want a more specific example of that, 1970, a study of helping in the shopping malls found that whether you found a dime or not in the coin return slot of a payphone made a big difference for whether you helped or not. Big difference. Like 15% versus 60%.
Wow.
5 years later, they tried to replicate it with many more participants and they couldn't get the result again. The first study only had like 20 or 30 participants in it. That's a very small number of participants. If you're trying to get a real demonstrable psychological finding, you need way more participants in your study than just a couple dozen. I don't think that those first researchers were doing anything malicious or dishonest. I think they just conducted the study poorly.
Right. And had a small sample size.
Small sample size. Yep.
Wait, Al, what do we find about so I didn't get it. So it said something like
something about the
ESP.
ESP results.
Yeah, I don't think that was it. I don't think it was ESP. It was like one of these type of studies that Christian just described. It was literally like so like if something happens in the environment, it automatically makes you do something different ethically. So it was one of those. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was just so funny because Kahneman like fought so hard for it. Then he was like, oh yeah, actually that's not true. So it's so interesting. You get this a lot in like research where I'm assuming, and I mean this is going like super on tangent, but the thing is like with a lot of researchers, I mean we always want to have like obviously not a research, but I'm assuming that people want to have like this big aha discovery, and then so what you get is obviously these kind of studies where so I guess if it's not dishonesty, the idea is it's like wishful thinking. They sort of buy into it without doing too much questioning, because I mean the idea is again publish or perish. I mean we've heard this a million times. So
Yep. Yeah, I mean you're right. Results that are not attention grabbing are typically not going to get published.
Right.
So you want to get those attention grabbing results, and just making small moves or having small findings are not going to help your career. Yep, there's no doubt about it. And also not finding anything, finding no relationship.
Yep.
Sometimes that's good to know, but it's not going to help you get published often. So yeah, it's the attention, and also taking it to the next level of leveraging this into a popular book and the speaker series and appeering on Oprah or something like that, or on the Seize the Moment podcast.
Right.
So that kind of thing. If you have some little results, you're not going to open those doors. So,
No, sorry, super quick. I just like how you juxtaposed Oprah and sees
Yeah.
Never know. Clearly on the same level.
You never know.
Yeah, but and I was thinking, like, literally, we're talking power poses, right? Like, I mean, who was it? Like Amy Cuddy, like she literally went on, all across the world just talking about these power poses. And again, and by the way, I think the other thing, I'm sure you guys would agree, is just people love simple solutions. So like nudging was a big one, even though nudging is actually a good one. But the idea is, it's like, if we could just change one simple thing, like power posing, right? And then we get all of this self-esteem, like, oh my God, of course, let's write a book about it, right? Who wouldn't love that? Who needs to waste all that time and money on therapy?
But reality is messy. Reality is complicated. There almost are never any quick, easy solutions like this. We hope they are. We dream for them. You're right to say that. And it sells lots of copies of books. The ethics drug. Someone claimed to find the part of the brain that's the ethics part of the brain, and then came up with a drug, and you could just take this drug and we'll make people a lot more moral.
Wow.
Yeah.
That really happened.
Oversimplifying, but something like those lines.
God.
Yeah. Sorry.
So, okay. And then one of the final questions before we wrap up, and this is going to be a super broad one.
Sure.
So where do you hope and where do you envision that sort of the research on obviously on honesty, where is it going to go? Where do you want it to go?
Yeah. I mean, we're realistic that we're just starting out here. We're starting making baby steps, and I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to start by just understanding the phenomena better. I want to understand, what is honesty? I got to define my terms, be clear about the concept. How is it different from other concepts? But where I'd love it to go eventually is in the direction of interventions. So by that, I mean, actually taking it from neglected, not just in the academic sense, but neglected in society, and doing something about that neglect. Practically new, or maybe they can be old, or just effective strategies for growing in honesty as a person, as a society, as a human species. That's what I really want. I don't want this just to be academic. It's helpful for it to start that way, but it'd be really sad if it stayed at the level of academic discourse.
Oh, I love that. So it's like, what you're pretty much saying is, let's stop trying to define it and let's start trying to actualize it.
Yeah, eventually though, but don't skip that first stuff. I mean, it's tempting to go right to the, let's encourage it, let's grow in it, let's practice, let's have some, new school strategies. Let's change the workplace in these kind of ways. Well, hold on a second. Let's do the preliminary work carefully, but not stay at the preliminary work forever.
No,
that's what I would want to say.
Yeah. And I would even guess that some of the research on honesty is really also looking at the actual effects of it as well. Now, not just specifically like which strategies work, like kind of foster it, but also when we do have it, right, in the environments that we do have it, what sort of environments does it actually help create?
Yep, that's right. So looking at consequences or outputs, or the impact of honesty on other variables. So we are the Honesty Project here at Wake Forest. We're doing research, but we also funded 16 teams around the world in the amount of $2 million total to do all new exciting research on honesty, much of which is along those lines. Looking at the impact of honesty on something else. So honest feedback on mentoring relationships. Give you a specific example. Honest feedback in romantic relationships. Does it strengthen the romantic relationship or not? Those kind of impacts. We're doing a lot of that research too.
Yeah. Wow. I love that so much.
Yeah. Plus doing rigorous preliminary research is what's going to differentiate the information that you're going to espouse and people like yourself from, just that general sort of, by the way, not knocking self-help or what consultants do for different companies. A lot of it is grounded in research, but I mean, some just kind of write a whole book on this kind of stuff before doing the research, as you're saying. So I think that's incredibly important. And when we can have that really backing, the literature and ways to intervene and really make this an actionable thing in society. I think that's what's going to make a bigger difference, as opposed to just kind of working on ways to sort of clickbait or hype up these things without that important work.
What I would also add is it seems like it also at least comes a bit closer to closing that is odd gap. So just, for our listeners, the idea is that you can't get, the sort of the kind of general philosophical understanding is you can't get an ought to it is if there are sort of basic facts, just like we talked about earlier with evolution. Just because certain things evolve to be a certain way doesn't necessarily mean they need to be, right? But I think what this research says is, well, hold on, right? If we can sort of show that honesty fosters a better society, then maybe we could start thinking about, again, you're not going to fully close it, but sort of take that gap and narrow it a little bit between what is and what could be.
That's right. That's been the focus of my research. You just summed up nicely in the last 10 years, not just on honesty, but on character in general. My last book was called The Character Gap, the gap between how we actually are and how we should be.
Right.
And it's important to understand how we actually are. Psychology can help with that. It's important to understand how we should be. Philosophy can help with that. But ultimately, it's in the service of taking both sides and bringing them closer together.
Right.
Bringing the is up, elevating the is closer to the ought.
Right.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Love that. Perfect endpoint. Alan, final questions for Christian before we go?
Yes. If we wanted to follow your work, where could we find
you? Just on social media at Character Gap. One word, Character Gap. Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, the usual places. So, and even email, if anyone wants to carry out a more extensive discussion, feel free to email me. Just find me at Wake Forest Philosophy Department.
Awesome. And your book on honesty, I'm assuming, is available on all major platforms, right?
It is. It's from Oxford University Press, published in 2021. And Amazon can help you, but plenty of other places can too. Yep.
Oh, awesome. Christian, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Amazing.
It's always great to be with you guys. So take care.
Absolutely, man. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. There you have it, guys. So if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and and TikTok. That's right. We are on TikTok. And also at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe.
Hit the bell on YouTube.
That's right. And guys, as always, thanks for watching. Keep seizing the moment and see you next time.